Great. Thank you very, very much, Kathy, for reading that. And by the way, sorry, I just started the recording of our of our study, and I forgot. I'd forgotten it. So if anybody's watching this recording, please know that we just heard Matthew chapter 9, verses 10 through 17. Yeah. So what's going on in these scriptures? What jumps out at you in this?
The Pharisees don't like what he's doing, and they don't think he's doing things the right way, so they're kind of calling him out on it.
Yeah, and they say you're sitting. Why are you hanging out with these tax collectors and these sinners? Have you ever been in a situation? Can you relate to this? Has there ever been a time where you've been judged by somebody for who you hang out with? Okay, probably not any recent examples, but since we probably aren't hanging out with too many people right now. But have you ever, or what would it look like? What do you think, what would it look like in today's world? Can you imagine any situations where you could see people getting flack for being with, those people, whoever those people are?
Well, there's the controversy with people not wearing masks. Sorry, Ron.
The people that help the homeless, everybody kind of thinks why are they hanging out with them? They're dirty, they're filthy. They may have a lot of diseases, etc. And so a lot of people don't take any pity on those folks. And they kind of scorn those that do and are trying to help them.
And I think nowadays we can they justify that because of the coronavirus, that those are people more likely to have it. And so you should stay away. You have even more reason to stay away from them.
Yeah. I think those are both great examples. I know, this was just about 20 years ago. I can't believe it's been 20 years since I graduated high school. It's about 20 years ago. I know that in high school I was a part of back then they called it a gay straight alliance. And so supporting friends who self-identified as LGBTQ, and I remember one family gathering where like my cousin and my granddad and my uncles were just really giving me a hard time about like, why are you spending time with them? Like, why would you, like, are you gay? Is that why you're, like, why would you care about them if you're not them? Like, why would you do that? And that was a really interesting kind of eye-opening, because I didn't even know they were kind of carrying that prejudice. And so kind of learning about that.
I can kind of...
Go ahead, Kelly.
I can kind of relate to that, Steve, because when our oldest daughter told us that she was gay, my reaction was more, what are people going to think about her? I was more afraid for her and what kind of support she was going to have, so that was hard for me.
Yeah. I mean, and my sister's, my brother-in-law is an immigrated African, and they'll still every now and again, before coronavirus, when people actually talk to each other, but like there would be times where guys would come up to Sarah, to my sister, and be like, is this guy bothering you? Assuming that because he was African and she's white, that they weren't together, much less married. And she'd always have to be like, nope, that's my husband. I'm glad he's with me. Like, this is good. Thanks for your assumption. And welcome, Carly and Diane. It's good to see y'all.
Thank you. Sorry. Boss comes first.
And I don't know, and just so that everybody knows everybody, Kathy Huff, Carly, and Diane, I don't know if you guys have had much time together, but
I recognize you.
We've passed. Yeah, we've passed and said hi.
Hey, we're on Matthew chapter 9, verses 10 through 17 right now. Good. So yeah, the Pharisees are concerned that Jesus is hanging out with the wrong crowd. And what do you think Jesus means? In verse 13, Jesus says, go figure out what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. What do you think he means in that?
I was wondering if it, sacrifice being part of the ritual, the old law, without any heart in it. You just do it because you're told and it's a ritual. But mercy, it involves forgiveness and understanding and loving the person. And that's what he desires rather than just a blind following.
I think that's a great way to put it. I think that's really, really good. At the last church I served, we had a really hard time. We had to have some really good and really hard conversations because last church I served was First Christian downtown, and in that neighborhood, that's one of the few neighborhoods where registered sex offenders can live, because you have to live a certain distance away from schools. And also that and the combination of less expensive housing. That was one of the few places where people could find who were on the sex offenders registry could live. And so that was a challenge for us. The church decided to be a welcoming space, to be able to somehow balance the need for safe spaces for families and kids, but also for sex offenders who were trying to make healthy life choices and to be able to have a new start. But boy, oh boy, that sure took a lot of mercy. It took a lot of mercy, and it took a lot of good, healthy guidelines and balance and some boundaries. Oh my gosh, Kathy, remind me your dog's name.
What?
What's your dog's name?
Ginger, and she's barking. She wants to be in the same room as I am, but we have so many people walking by our house nowadays. If they have a dog, she barks. I'm sorry.
No, she's like all of us. We get excited.
We just had to put ours away. Ours were getting rowdy.
See, you guys have your dogs away, and I have my door closed so that my kids don't come in. So, we're all... no. So, but I think that's right. Yeah. How do we balance and not just talk about faith, but sometimes it's really hard when you're around folks who really are in need of mercy. That can be a challenge, and there you can have some really hard conversations as a community of what do we really stand for. Good. So we have the Pharisees come to Jesus, and then who comes to Jesus next in that verse 14?
John's disciples.
John's disciples. Wait, John who? Why is there a John? I thought Jesus was the one with disciples.
John the Baptist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and I don't know if you did you know that John the Baptist had a following?
Yeah.
No.
No.
I think we talked about that before.
Oh, did we? Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah, and I looked it up some more because I couldn't remember the name of what it's called, because there are still some followers of John the Baptist. Worldwide, there's only about 60 or 70,000. Most of them are still in that region where John the Baptist and Jesus lived, and kind of near the Jordan River. But they're, I believe it's pronounced Mandaism. But yeah, so there are still followers of John the Baptist. And so then what are they saying? What's their beef with Jesus?
That he's not fasting.
Yeah, and what is this? Are they upset so much that he's? I don't know if you ever have this situation. Sometimes when people come to you, and it turns out the issue isn't the issue. You know, like they want to talk about, I'm so angry about X, Y, and Z, but it's really about something else deeper than the surface issue. What are they? Do you think it's about the fasting, or is fasting kind of representing something deeper for them?
That's Dan's phone.
Twilight Zone.
It gets my attention.
And ours.
Did you see that meme about Cinco de Mayo? Like,
Let me go put them out.
it was about, it was like a Twilight Zone, and they're like,
Yeah.
yeah,
Taco Tuesday and the coronavirus. Yeah, we saw that this morning.
because what was always the opening line of like, there's a world, or like imagine a world where
Yes.
Yeah,
where
something like
Cinco
that.
de Mayo falls on Taco Tuesday, but no one can enjoy it because of a disease called Corona.
Yeah.
Yeah, so these followers of John the Baptist come up and they say, Jesus, why don't you and your disciples fast? And again, they may be talking about fasting, but what they're really talking about is kind of what Dan was getting at and what those Pharisees were getting at. Why don't you do the stuff? Why don't you do the ritual and the practices that we look at as so important in faith? Why don't you do those practices, those markers of faith? And what's Jesus's response about why they don't focus so much on the markers?
Well, he's saying you have to have a reason, like why a legitimate reason, like why put a piece of unshrunk cloth in an old cloak, or put new wine in an old wineskin? So what's your reason?
Yeah.
Purpose for it.
Yeah, Jesus was really good. If you've never heard that Simon Sinek TED talk about the golden circle, he, at the very center of what we need to get to is the why. Jesus was always really good of getting to the question of why. So often we focus on what we do or how we do it, but Jesus wants us to get to the why. And so maybe you have an example. Do you ever feel like there's something, either maybe we do it at South Point, or you've seen it expressed in other faith communities, something that for some people is a really important ritual or practice, but maybe you're feeling like it's not connected to the deep why?
I think throughout history, excuse me, that a lot of the traditions of any church were tied to some type of worship that they had seen before. So it became common to them to use those, and then they became so familiar and they felt so comfortable with it, they kept doing it, and they didn't ask, like my nephew used to ask, why, Papa, why? And so it keeps going that way, and it's perpetuated, and then it becomes ingrained just like the dye in a cloth, and it doesn't go away. And unless the church tries to modernize and change those types of things, it just still stays the same. An example is look at the Catholic Church and all their traditions and everything that they do. And even us, you know, look at what we do at Christmas. Didn't used to be that way maybe, but now it is. And it depends upon the organization as to whether it's going to get ingrained or whether it's going to change over a period of time.
Yeah, and I don't want you to hear me saying like that ritual or rhythm is bad, because I think ritual and rhythm is really, really good and can speak really deeply, but we have to know what it's pointing to. Paul Tillich, a great 20th century theologian, I always loved this quote of his that he said, "Symbols only have power if we know what they're pointing to." And so, you know, sometimes our symbols lose their meaning because we don't know what they do. You know, one of the things I was thinking about that a lot of churches struggle with, and I think even we as a church struggle with, is like altar calls. You know, if you've ever been in traditions where every Sunday, you know, I used to have a pastor growing up. I don't know, maybe I haven't learned all the lessons from this, but I would get a little sleepy during his sermons. And he was this great he had this great Texas drawl. And I always knew that we were getting ready to stand up and sing when I'd hear him say, "Do you know Jesus? Is he your Lord and Savior? If not, maybe now is the time to come forward." You know, and we were always like, "All right, let's open up the hymnal where we, you know."
And you sing all the verses of Just As I Am. We grew up Southern Baptist, and we had the invitation and walking the aisle, and it did become very rote sometimes. You knew which songs were the invitation songs and how many verses you were going to sing. No matter if anybody came forward, you were going to sing all 6 of the verses. But it can become very ritualistic. But on the other hand, sometimes we miss the altar call and the time that you can come forward and pray either by yourself or because in the Southern Baptist Church, when you come forward, you always go up and speak with the pastor, either to join the church, become a Christian, or even if you need him to pray with you or whatever. So there were some good things about it, but it did lose its meaning because, yeah, it was just a part of the service. You always had the invitation.
And I mean, even without the altar calls, you know, I mean, well, Diane, you and Carly we had these conversations. We had you over to our house and we talked about membership
Yes.
and like, what does that look like at this church? And I think churches, you know, in a world of Facebook, of, well, you like it or you follow it, or
Yes.
and we have memberships at Sam's Club and Costco. So how is it any different of being a member of a church?
Right.
And so, you know, I think that even the whole concept of membership is one of those things that we have to update and to become aware of the why
Yes.
of it. I mean, and, you know, Jesus they give him a hard time for not fasting. But remember, Jesus's ministry starts with 40 days of fasting.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not that he's anti-fasting. It's just that he wasn't doing it in a way that they felt was the ritually proper way. It's the same way Jesus we'll see continually throughout this gospel. We'll see Jesus getting in trouble with the religious leaders because he wasn't doing the religious things in the way that they expected, especially around Sabbath. Jesus deeply loved Sabbath and deeply lived Sabbath, but it wasn't in the ways that they expected.
Well, yeah, it's almost like they were like they were bragging about their fasting and about their you know, how good we are because we fast. And then he very vividly points out, you know, well, you know, what is behind your fasting? Is there, you know.
Can I ask a question? Was the fasting just for the Jewish people, or did like the tax collectors, did they fast too?
Well, that's a great question. So, I mean, I think in the case, so like in the case of the tax collectors and sinners that Jesus was eating with, they were Jewish as well, probably,
Okay.
because he's back in Galilee. He's back on their side of the Sea of Galilee. So it's probably an all Jewish community. So probably even the tax collectors who worked for the occupying Roman force were still probably Jewish, and so they
Okay.
still probably fasted. Yeah. Where are you going with that? I'm liking your thought.
Well, I was just wondering if the tax collectors didn't have that in their daily life, the fasting, and I don't know where it is in the Bible, but not to be a stumbling rock for someone else. And so I was just wondering if that was part of why maybe they weren't fasting, is because he was with people who didn't do that normally.
Oh yeah. I
That's
like
why.
yeah, I like your train of thought on that. That's good. Hey, so in verses 16 and 17, and then we'll move on to the next part of this chapter, but one last question on this 16 and 17, with these examples of old and new put together. Are there times where you felt like there needed to be a separation between old and new, or even a time where you might challenge what Jesus is saying and saying, no, there needs to be continuity, that there can be old and new together?
I'm kind of, when we do praise team music, sometimes we'll do a hymn. It might be more of a jazzier version, but to me, that's kind of mixing the old with the newer praise songs. So I don't know if that's kind of
I
what
think
you were
that's a
talking
great
about.
example. Yeah, and I like that. I like when you can connect to say, hey, it's not contemporary music and hymnody. Like, this is all just making a joyful noise to God. They can both be one and the same and both be worshipful. Yeah. So what do you think? Where do you think Jesus would say? Because Jesus both did a whole bunch of, for example, with the Sabbath, he still deeply practiced Sabbath, but in a new way. So what do you think he's trying to say here, where he's talking about the separation of the old and the new?
What he's talking about is the old is not going to work like the new is going to work. So if you try to combine the old with the new, not going to work. Just like sewing a new patch over an old garment won't work, because the new patch will tear the old garment and the old garment will fall apart. And the same is putting the wine in the old wineskin versus putting the wine in a new wineskin.
And I love that Jesus is using example on both of these, where arguably the older is better. Because you want that well-aged wine. You don't want that new tart, overly tannic stuff. You want the old, mellow, smooth wine. And if you're putting a patch on a piece of clothing, you obviously love that clothing and you want to keep using it. And so instead of getting a whole new cloak, you're patching up the old. So I love that this is an example of Jesus using something that he's saying that the old has value, that the old is important. And Ron, I think you're right on it. I think you're right on it, that you can't just put a new thing on old expectations, and kind of just rely on what worked then for what works now. I think that over the last 30 or 40 years, the church as a whole, the universal church, has had a lot of those situations of, well, if we just do X, Y, and Z better, or do it again like we used to, or do it more, it'll have the same results it did in the past. Yeah, and so sometimes we have to look for a new way. We have to look for a new way to get results.
And I think he's pointing that his way is a new way, that you can't look at what he's giving with the same old view, that his religion, so to speak, is a new way of looking at faith. It's a new faith.
I would totally agree. And yet to remember that he's also said, remember a few chapters ago in his Sermon on the Mount, he said, do not think that I've come to abolish the law,
Right.
But to
but I've come
fulfill
to
it.
fulfill.
Right.
Yeah. And so, he kind of lives in this area of tension. Like, don't expect me to do things the old way. This is going to be new, but I'm trying to get to the core of what the old was, but I'm going to do it in a new way. So we see him doing this in a new way, and we'll see this. Let's read. Would somebody be willing to read verses 18 through 26?
I can.
Thanks.
While he was saying this, a ruler came and knelt before him and said, "My daughter has just died, but come and put your hand on her and she will live." Jesus got up and went with him, and so did his disciples. Just then, a woman who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak. She said to herself, "If I only touch his cloak, I will be healed." Jesus turned and saw her. "Take heart, daughter," he said, "your faith has healed you." And the woman was healed from that moment. When Jesus entered the ruler's house and saw the flute players and the noisy crowd, he said, "Go away, the girl is not dead but asleep." But they laughed at him. After the crowd had been put outside, he went in and took the girl by the hand, and she got up. News of this spread through all that region.
Thank you. Yeah, what jumps out at you in these stories? What's this newness that Jesus is doing and bringing?
The importance of faith. That faith has made you, your faith has made you well.
Absolutely.
Although his faith was not maybe as strong as the centurion. I mean, he thought Jesus needed to come and touch her. And the centurion was just,
Yeah.
So now,
not that it was, any bad or good. It just, he thought Jesus had to physically do something to.
but I think, Kathy, were you referring to the woman who had been hemorrhaging, who reaches out to Jesus?
Mhm.
Right. That's true.
Yeah. And I love that it starts the story and we think that we're going to be focusing on Jesus and we're assuming the male leader of the synagogue. So we see that Jesus, even though he got done just talking about focusing on the new, not on the old, the very first person he goes to help is a leader of the synagogue. So he's not throwing out the synagogue. He's not stopping his care and his compassion for those in the old ways, those who hold up the old ways. He's still loving them and caring for them and for their family. But then he also takes the time to notice, and can you imagine that, just to be able to feel, to have that kind of empathic power to be able to know when somebody has touched you.
Touched you, yeah.
have you ever been around folks who kind of are really good at reading a room, or have that deep amount of empathy, or kind of who are tuned um, to energy like that? It's really amazing. I would bet you, because I know there are a few folks even within our congregation who are really good at being able to, they feel, they deeply feel. I think if you don't have a deep feeler in your life, I know I tend to work from the head. I tend to think things through and argue things through and come up with rational, discussion points. But I think Jesus is showing us a really good balance. He's thinking, he's doing, and he's feeling.
The person comes to mind, Lisa Gingenbach, to me, seems to be able to feel what's going on and tune in right away. I don't know.
Lisa's one of those that came to my mind too. Yes. Yeah.
Most perceptive.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think oftentimes, especially in our kind of like post-enlightenment world, we often talk about, we often don't give the same credit to feelings as we do to things that you can think about. And I think Jesus is showing here the importance of feeling. And in fact, we don't have to stop talking about this, but I'll just read the last few verses of this, and we'll see how Jesus's ministry is so motivated by his feelings. So I'm going to start in verse 35. Then Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and curing every disease and every sickness. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them, because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, ask the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest." So what do you hear Jesus saying here? What's motivating Jesus's ministry?
Compassion, I think.
Compassion. Mhm.
Yes. Yes. And and that's where I think talking about the feelers and the thinkers and the doers, that compassion, for some of us, it comes really naturally. And for some of us, we have to kind of work to cultivate it. And there's nothing wrong with that. But how do you cultivate compassion? What do you do to make sure that you are acting and feeling compassionately?
Well, for me, I have to stop and give it time. It doesn't come my first reaction usually, unless it's someone I'm in or invested in or involved in. But compassion to a stranger or someone I didn't know, I really have to stop and work at it a little more. It's not my first trait, I guess.
Is anybody else feeling like Dan? Is that kind of where you're at? Anybody else there too?
Sometimes I feel that way. I think, I say this kind of jokingly, but really it's kind of true. As a former school teacher, I mean, really, and I taught in an inner city middle school, I kind of developed a bucket up kind of attitude that I have to work around, and remember that though people do need to buck it up sometimes, there is often a reason for that. And that's kind of in conflict with the other side of me, in that throughout my life, I have had some hardships personally. And so because of those hardships, I can see the other side of that coin. So for me, it's kind of a balancing act, and remembering that I'm not still an 8th grade school teacher. And not everybody is an 8th grade girl. Who are wicked,
They
by
are
the way.
wicked. They are wicked. Be glad you don't have girls, Steve.
And as a teacher, like little ones, I think I have a lot of compassion
Right.
because I worked with. It's just a different age level, but
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think your experiences do contribute to
they do.
the kind of compassion you have for people. You know, we were in a church in Raleigh who was getting ready to open a home type situation for women and children. I think abused women and children. And I can remember one of the meetings discussing that. So many people, because they were going to be open the same time our daycare was open, and there were people that were concerned about their children on the playground at the same time our children were on the playground. And so and you know, I stood up and said, you know, we were almost those people. We were almost homeless, and they're not low lives for the most part. They're people that have had hard things happen in their life. And so we, you know, it was just a difference of we had been there. We understand, you know, because so many times homeless people are people that are poor or having a hard time, are kind of looked down upon and as lazy, or, you know, what did they do to do that? And we knew we were that poor and we were almost homeless, and we weren't low lives and lazy. And I mean, sometimes we felt like it, but you know, we have a compassion for people like that, whereas maybe we wouldn't have. I have a compassion for people that have lost children at birth because I've been through that. I mean, so I think your experiences, you know, lead you in that direction.
You're right. So much is experience, what you've actually been through.
Mhm.
You realize that people aren't the way they are, just they weren't born that way. That so much of it has to do with their life and what they've been through.
Right.
I think this is so much great.
You realize that too. You can't be a good teacher without understanding that kids are the way they are because of things that have happened to them.
Right.
Yeah, and so how do we, yeah, I think trying to be able to locate ourselves in and to see ourselves in the other, to see the humanity and the holy in the other, and that does take, sometimes that takes some energy, and sometimes that takes some vulnerability. And, you know, Carly, what I hear you talking about, I mean, part of that is probably boundaries that as a teacher you had to set up. But also, you know, compassion fatigue can happen.
Yeah.
I know Erin Putney, who teaches nursing in our congregation, she used to be an ER nurse, and when she told me one time that she had to quit that because she just got tired of seeing people keep doing the same stupid things over and over and keep ending up back in her ER, and she just stopped having compassion for them.
Mhm.
Well, you notice I don't teach school anymore. There is a reason for that.
Yeah, and I think it's good to be aware of, and I think what we see Jesus doing is modeling really well of when he needs to slow down, kind of how Dan was talking about, to really feel and to think. He also, I mean, this story, don't forget, this story started off with Jesus having dinner, sharing meals with those who were seen as the other, as the outsider. We have to actually get to know people who we may not normally associate with in order to see the humanity. Jesus is finding ways to break down these barriers that we put up that creates this, it's not God-made, it's man-made ideas of us and them. And Jesus is constantly working to break those down and to be able to find the shared humanity while also maintaining his identity. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I just think it's really significant in this passage and throughout Matthew that, but particularly in this passage, Jesus goes from healing with a centurion, a Roman person, to a woman who is, to sinners and tax collectors who were hated, to a woman who was probably in the Jewish community lowest on the totem pole, right, to a ruler who was highest on the totem pole. And I think that shows that models to us that there are no boundaries of who we can relate right to and help and interact with.
Absolutely. I think that's a great, maybe that's a really good thing to help us transition to our final little bit here about what are your takeaways. What is it that you see in this that you want to take with you this week, or what's something new or something that connects with you?
I think it's just more proof of how awesome Jesus is. And I think the more I do Bible study and read about Jesus, the more I realize what a wonderful Savior he was or is.
Yeah, awesome.
I think too, I think about, if this isn't all just fluffy good feelings, Jesus just went around, and Jesus was also being criticized and beaten up, and I think sometimes when we are doing good stuff, and I'm sure as a pastor, Steve, you too, you just, everybody knows about roasting the pastor on Sunday afternoon. So, but, it's not all great, I'm just going to go around doing great things for people. He was constantly criticized and questioned about what he was doing. And, I think we get questioned for maybe some of our ministries, why are you doing that? And, and why are you having, dinner with someone like that? Or, so I think, we can look at him as an example again of, just do what we know is what we're supposed to be doing in spite of what other people are maybe saying about us. I don't know.
I like that. That's a part of the takeaway for me, that in order for me to keep my why, my center, I need to constantly be remembering that, of what the why is that motivates me, and what that call from God is. And I think we each have those. But for me as pastor, I know that is an important thing right there with you, Diane. Any other?
To sign off, I have something at 10 o'clock, so.
It was great to see you.
Glad you joined us.
Good to see everyone.
You too.
You too.
I could see you in person.
We'll see if. There we go. Any other takeaways?
Well, I was thinking about the people that I work with after reading this. I hadn't really thought about this before, but since I work with people with physical and mental disabilities, a lot of them kind of fit into these people that Jesus was with. You know, they may drool, they may seem demon possessed at times. And, you know, there are people that not everyone wants to be around. But I'm not saying that I'm in the place of Jesus. I'm just saying that now when I have a bad day and that, you know, their whatever behavior or whatever is really getting on my nerves, I have to remember that I need to have the compassion that Jesus had, and just, you know, they're people too, and you just meet them where they are and take
think
care of
you-
whatever needs that they may have at that time. It's not always fun. It's not always glamorous, but you know, you do it because you have love.
And I do think you have a lot of compassion, Barb.
Oh, well, thank you.
That's a hard population. We go to the Special
It is.
Olympics things with my granddaughter, and that's a hard population to work with. You have to have a special gift to work with that population. So,
And you do, Barb, you do.
Oh, well, thank you.
And I don't. So I have to always remember that, you know, Jesus loves them just as much as he loves
Right.
me.
That's right.
And sometimes when I look at people, I can think of a couple in particular that I have always reminded myself that, you know, God loves him too.
sometimes we go, why?
Yeah.
But yeah.
In fact, you even missed it before we started off. Before you guys had a chance to join us, I think Ron was starting our conversation about something like that.
Yeah.
That Ron was struggling to love and see as fully human.
Not a conversation, a rant.
Oh, well, thank you all for the conversation, for the way that you've opened up your hearts and the ways that we've shared today. And to be able to find that sometimes these stories of Jesus are way too fresh and hit way too close to home. Yeah. Is there anybody who'd be willing to close this out in a little bit of prayer today? I can do it.
All you, Steve.
God, thank you for the ways that you remind us that you love each and every one of us. God, whether we're blessed with just reservoirs of compassion, or if we have to slow down and really pause, or if we need to share a meal with someone to be able to see their humanity, God, help us. And help us remember that you extend those graces to us. And we are so grateful for your son who even though the many ways that we've fallen short, that he loves us, and that you constantly reach out to us. Thank you for your grace. Thank you for your forgiveness. And thank you for this message of hope and compassion and love that we not only get to receive, but that we get to share. Help us do that even in this weird COVID time of social isolation. Help us reach out to our brothers and sisters in new ways to show your love and to show your compassion. We pray this in your son's name. Amen.
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 Hey, thank you all very much.